Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. I know you use this video to fall asleep. If you enjoy our stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what city are you watching? I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, let's dive in. The brass nameplate on the wrought iron gates read, Ravens Hollow Manor Established, 1847. But Marcus Chen had already decided he didn't care about the history. He needed the job, and the isolation suited him fine. After 18 months of unemployment and watching his savings dwindle to nothing, he wasn't about to let a few ghost stories scare him away from steady work. The estate manager, Mrs. Whitmore, had been surprisingly forthright during the phone interview. The previous janitor left rather suddenly, she'd said, her voice crackling through the connection. The work isn't difficult, but the house has particular requirements. You'll find everything you need to know in the caretaker's office. Marcus pulled his rusted Honda through the gates, gravel crunching under the tires as he wound up the tree-lined drive. Ravens Hollow Manor emerged from the morning mist like something from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of weathered stone, with towers that pierced the gray sky and windows that seemed to watch his approach. Ivy crawled up the walls in thick, dark veins, and several of the upper windows were boarded shut. He parked near the servants' entrance and grabbed his duffel bag from the back seat. The job came with housing, a small apartment above the old carriage house, which was another blessing he couldn't afford to question. His divorce had left him with little more than his work clothes and a desperate need to disappear for a while. The key Mrs. Whitmore had mailed him turned easily in the heavy oak door. Inside, the servants' hallway stretched into shadows, lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women in period dress. The air smelled of old wood polish and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made him wrinkle his nose. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as he made his way to the caretaker's office, a cramped room tucked beneath the main staircase. A desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with cleaning schedules, supply inventories, and a ring of keys that looked like they belonged in a medieval castle. But it was the piece of paper tacked to the corkboard above the desk that caught his attention. The heading, written in careful script, read, Rules for the Night Custodian of Ravens Hollow Manor. Marcus almost smiled. Every job had its quirks, and old money families were notorious for their peculiar demands. He'd worked for enough wealthy clients to know they often had elaborate preferences about how their homes should be maintained. He pulled the paper down and began to read. Rules for the Night Custodian of Ravens Hollow Manor 1. Begin work each evening at precisely 8 p.m. Never start earlier, regardless of circumstances. 2. The East Wing is off limits between midnight and 3 a.m. Do not enter this area during these hours under any circumstances. 3. If you hear piano music coming from the music room, do not investigate. Continue with your duties and ignore it completely. 4. The mirrors in the blue room must be covered with cloth every night before 11 p.m. Fresh cloths are kept in the linen closet. 5. Never turn your back on the portrait of Elias Ravenshollow in the Grand Hall. Face it when passing, walk backwards if necessary. 6. If any door that should be locked is found open, close it immediately and sprinkle salt across the threshold. Salt is kept in the kitchen pantry. 7. Do not speak to or acknowledge any figure you may see in the windows after midnight. They are not real. 8. The library is to be cleaned only on Tuesdays. Never enter on any other day of the week. 9. If you hear your name being called, do not respond unless you can see who is calling you. 10. Should you encounter Mrs. Eleanor Ravenshollow in the hallways, show proper respect but do not engage in conversation. She passed away in 1923. 11. All work must be completed and you must be in your quarters by 4 a.m. This is not negotiable. 12. These rules exist for your protection. Breaking them may result in consequences beyond termination of employment. Remember, the Ravenshollow family has occupied this manor for 6 generations. Treat their home and its residents with appropriate respect. Marcus read the list twice, waiting for the punchline that never came. The formal tone and specific details suggested this wasn't a joke, but the content was absolutely absurd. Piano music and portraits and dead people in the hallways. He set the paper aside and shook his head. Rich people and their eccentricities. Maybe the previous janitor had been fired for falling asleep on the job, and Mrs. Whitmore had decided to have some fun with the replacement. Or perhaps the family had a history of mental illness that manifested in elaborate fantasies about their ancestral home. Whatever the explanation, Marcus had bills to pay and nowhere else to go. If his employers wanted him to pretend their house was haunted, he'd play along. He'd worked stranger jobs. The rest of the office contained exactly what he'd expected. Cleaning supplies, equipment manuals, and a detailed floor plan of the manor's 3 stories and basement. The building was enormous. 43 rooms, not counting bathrooms and storage areas. The east wing alone contained 12 bedrooms, a private library, and what the plan labeled as Lady Eleanor's study. Marcus spent the afternoon exploring his new workplace, getting familiar with the layout and taking inventory of what needed attention. The manor was beautiful in a faded, melancholy way. High ceilings soared above rooms filled with antique furniture, their surfaces covered in dust sheets. Massive fireplaces dominated the common areas, their mantels lined with family photographs spanning more than a century. Everywhere he looked, Ravenshollow faces stared back at him. Pale, serious people with dark eyes and sharp features. The music room contained a magnificent grand piano, its ebony surface reflecting the chandelier above. Marcus ran his fingers across the keys, producing a cascade of notes that echoed through the empty space. The sound was beautiful and clear, suggesting the instrument was kept in perfect tune despite the room's apparent disuse. In the grand hall, he found the portrait mentioned in the rules. Elias Ravenshollow, according to the brass nameplate, had been the family patriarch from 1847 to 1891. The painting showed a tall, gaunt man with piercing gray eyes and a severe expression. Something about the way the artist had captured those eyes made Marcus uncomfortable. They seemed to track his movement across the room. By evening, Marcus had settled into his quarters above the carriage house. The apartment was small but comfortable, with a kitchenette, sitting area, and bedroom that looked out over the manor's rear gardens. Mrs. Whitmore had left groceries in the refrigerator and a note welcoming him to Ravenshollow. At exactly 8 p.m., he returned to the manor and began his first shift. The work itself proved straightforward enough. Marcus's duties involved dusting and polishing the common areas, maintaining the floors, and performing basic upkeep throughout the manor. The building was so large that he could only cover a portion each night, rotating through different sections on a weekly schedule. He followed the rules mechanically, treating them as an elaborate game. When 11 p.m. approached, he dutifully covered the mirrors in the blue room with white cloth, noting that the previous coverings were always neatly folded in the linen closet. He avoided the east wing during the specified hours, working instead in the west wing or the manor's lower levels. The portrait of Elias Ravenshollow was easy enough to manage. Marcus simply walked backwards when he needed to cross the Grand Hall during those times when his route would require turning away from the painting. It felt ridiculous, but no more so than some of the requirements he'd dealt with in previous jobs. On his third night, he heard the piano music. Marcus was cleaning the second-floor hallway when the sound drifted up from below, a slow, melancholy melody that seemed to fill the entire manor. His first instinct was investigative. Someone was obviously in the music room, and he should probably check to make sure they weren't a burglar or trespasser. Then he remembered rule number 3. He forced himself to continue dusting the banister, humming quietly to mask the piano's haunting notes. The music continued for nearly an hour, a repertoire of classical pieces played with obvious skill and deep emotion. Despite the rules, Marcus found himself drawn to the sound. Whoever was playing had real talent. When the music finally stopped, the silence felt oppressive. Marcus completed his work and returned to his apartment, telling himself that Mrs. Whitmore probably hired a musician to maintain the piano's condition. Old instruments needed regular use to stay in good repair. The next morning, he casually mentioned the music to Mrs. Whitmore when she called to check on his progress. "Music?" she said after a long pause. "What sort of music?" "Piano music from the music room. Classical pieces, mostly. Someone's very talented." Another pause. "Mr. Chen, there is no one else in the manor at night. The family is traveling in Europe and won't return until spring." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Then who? I trust you're following the rules I left for you?" "Yes, ma'am. Every one of them." "Good. Continue to do so. Is there anything else you need?" The conversation ended with more questions than answers, but Marcus pushed his doubts aside. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the family had given someone else access to the house, a music teacher or composer who used the piano for practice. Mrs. Whitmore might not know about the arrangement, or she might be testing his discretion. The rest of the week passed without major incident. Marcus learned to navigate the manor's peculiarities, developing routines that accommodated the mysterious rules. He heard the piano several more times, always the same beautiful, melancholy pieces. He covered the mirrors each night and found them uncovered each morning. He avoided the east wing during the specified hours and never encountered anything unusual. By Friday, he was almost comfortable. That changed when he found the first door. Marcus discovered the library door standing open on his 6th night when he was cleaning the second-floor hallway outside the main staircase. According to the floor plan, the library should have been locked. His key ring didn't include access to that room, and rule number 8 specified that it should only be cleaned on Tuesdays. But here it was, the heavy oak door standing ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway. Rule number 6 echoed in his mind. If any door that should be locked is found open, close it immediately and sprinkle salt across the threshold. Marcus approached the door cautiously, peering through the gap into the room beyond. The library was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked ancient and valuable. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rugs. Someone had left a book open on the reading table, alongside a crystal glass half filled with amber liquid. The scene looked so inviting, so normal, that Marcus almost stepped inside. Then he remembered the rules and firmly closed the door, turning the heavy brass handle until he heard the lock click into place. The salt was exactly where the rules said it would be. in the kitchen pantry in an unmarked ceramic container. Marcus sprinkled a thin line across the library threshold, feeling foolish but following instructions. When he returned 20 minutes later to collect his cleaning supplies, the salt was gone. The library door remained closed. That same night, as he was polishing the silver in the dining room, Marcus heard his name being called. Marcus Chen, ... The voice was soft and feminine, drifting from somewhere deeper in the manor. It sounded urgent, almost pleading, and his first instinct was to respond. Then rule number 9 stopped him cold. If you hear your name being called, do not respond unless you can see who is calling you. He continued polishing, hands trembling slightly as he worked. The voice called again, closer this time, and he forced himself to hum under his breath to mask the sound. After several minutes, the calling stopped. Marcus completed his shift and returned to his apartment. But sleep didn't come easily. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize what was happening. Old houses made strange noises, settling wood, shifting foundations, wind through loose windows. Combined with an overactive imagination and the power of suggestion from those ridiculous rules, it was easy to interpret normal sounds as something more sinister. But the library door had been open. He was sure of that. The weekend brought a temporary reprieve from the manor's oddities. Marcus used his time off to explore the local town, a small community called Millbrook that seemed to exist primarily to serve the needs of the surrounding estates. The people were friendly but reserved, and several mentioned that they'd heard he was working at Ravens Hollow. "That's a challenging position," said the clerk at the hardware store, an elderly man with knowing eyes. "How are you finding it?" "Fine so far," Marcus replied. "Quiet work." The clerk nodded slowly. "The Ravens Hollows have always been particular about their help. They've had the same cleaning service for decades, but the night custodian position has been more difficult to fill." "Oh? Why's that?" "People find the work unsettling. The previous custodian lasted only 3 weeks before he decided to move on. The one before that made it 6 weeks. You're already exceeding expectations." Marcus wanted to ask more questions, but something in the clerk's expression discouraged further inquiry. He purchased his supplies and left, more curious than ever about his new employer's history. That evening, he decided to do some research of his own. The Millbrook Public Library was small but well maintained, with a local history section that contained several books about the area's prominent families. Marcus found what he was looking for in a volume titled Great Houses of the Hudson Valley, published in 1987. The chapter on Ravens Hollow Manor painted a picture of wealth, tragedy, and gradual decline. Elias Ravens Hollow had built the manor in 1847, establishing a textile fortune that made him one of the wealthiest men in New York State. He'd married Eleanor Ashford in 1851, and they'd had 3 children: Thomas, Margaret, and Catherine. The family's fortunes had begun to turn in the 1880s. Thomas, the eldest son and heir, had died in a riding accident in 1883. Margaret had married and moved to Boston, dying of consumption in 1889. Catherine, the youngest, had never married and had lived at Ravens Hollow until her death in 1891, the same year her father passed away. Eleanor had inherited the estate and had lived there alone with a small staff until her death in 1923. According to the book, she'd become increasingly reclusive in her final years, rarely leaving the manor and speaking often of visits from her deceased family members. The property had passed to Margaret's son, who'd rarely visited and had eventually sold it to a distant cousin. The Ravens Hollow line had continued through various branches, but none had lived in the manor full-time since Eleanor's death. The current owners, descendants of the original family, maintained the property, but used it primarily as a summer residence. Marcus found the information interesting, but not particularly alarming. Wealthy families often had complicated histories, and old houses accumulated tragic stories over the decades. The references to Eleanor's mental state in her final years suggested a possible explanation for some of the manor's stranger traditions. Perhaps the rules had originated as a way to humor an elderly woman's delusions. But as he walked back to his car, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than the sanitized version he'd found in the library book. His 8th night at Ravens Hollow proved him right. Marcus was cleaning the portrait gallery on the 2nd floor when he saw her. She appeared at the far end of the hallway, a tall, elegant woman in a dark blue dress that might have been fashionable in the 1920s. Her gray hair was pinned up in an elaborate style, and she moved with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being observed. She was clearly elderly, but carried herself with dignity and grace. Marcus's first thought was that the family had returned early from their European trip. His second thought was that he should introduce himself and explain his presence in the house. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped as rule number 10 flashed through his mind. Should you encounter Mrs. Eleanor Ravens Hollow in the hallways, show proper respect but do not engage in conversation. She passed away in 1923. The woman approached slowly, her footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floors. As she drew closer, Marcus could see her face more clearly. Pale skin with high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed infinitely sad, and an expression of gentle melancholy. She was beautiful in the way that old photographs were beautiful, with a quality that seemed somehow removed from the present moment. Marcus stepped aside and nodded respectfully, keeping his eyes lowered. The woman passed within 3 feet of him, and he caught a whiff of lavender and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded him of funeral flowers. She continued down the hallway toward the east wing, her dress rustling softly with each step. When he looked up again, she was gone. Marcus stood frozen for several minutes, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd seen her clearly, not a glimpse or a shadow, but a full, detailed figure moving through the hallway with obvious purpose. The encounter had felt completely real, from the sound of her dress to the smell of her perfume. But, according to the rules, Mrs. Eleanor Ravens Hollow had died almost a century ago. Marcus completed his shift mechanically, his mind racing with possible explanations. Hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. A living relative who resembled the old photographs. An actor hired by the family to maintain their elaborate charade. Anything except the obvious conclusion that his rational mind refused to accept. The next morning, he called Mrs. Whitmore. "I need to ask you something about the rules," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Of course. What can I help you with?" Rule number 10 mentions Mrs. Eleanor Ravens Hollow. I think I may have seen someone in the hallway last night who matched her description." Silence stretched across the connection for so long that Marcus wondered if the call had been dropped. "Mrs. Whitmore? Mr. Chen, are you following all the rules exactly as written?" "Yes, ma'am. Every single one. And you showed proper respect when you encountered Mrs. Eleanor?" The matter-of-fact way she said it made Marcus's blood run cold. "You're not surprised that I saw her. The Ravens Hollow family has lived in that house for 6 generations. Mrs. Whitmore said quietly. "Some of them have never left. As long as you follow the rules, you'll be perfectly safe. The rules exist to maintain balance. Balance between what? Between the living and the dead, Mr. Chen. Between what was and what is. The Ravens Hollows take their responsibilities as hosts very seriously, even now." Marcus wanted to hang up the phone and drive away from Ravens Hollow Manor as fast as his car would take him. But he had nowhere else to go, no other prospects, and no money to start over somewhere new. And despite everything that defied logic, he hadn't been harmed. Frightened, yes, but not hurt. "What happened to the previous janitors?" he asked. "They broke the rules," Mrs. Whitmore said simply. "The first one tried to investigate the piano music. The second one entered the East Wing during the forbidden hours. The third one attempted to speak with Mrs. Eleanor. What happened to them? They left. Suddenly and without notice, but they left. The Ravens Hollows don't tolerate disrespect, but they're not unreasonable. As long as you follow the rules, you can coexist peacefully." Marcus hung up the phone with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of relief. Mrs. Whitmore's calm acceptance of the situation suggested that he wasn't losing his mind. Whatever was happening at Ravens Hollow Manor, he wasn't the first person to experience it. He could handle a few ghosts if it meant keeping his job. How difficult could it be to follow 12 simple rules? Marcus managed to maintain his routine for another week, growing more comfortable with the manor's supernatural residents. He encountered Mrs. Eleanor twice more, always in the evening hours, always moving through the hallways with that same dignified grace. He nodded respectfully each time, and she seemed to acknowledge his presence with the slightest inclination of her head. The piano music became a regular part of his nights, sometimes lasting for hours. Marcus learned to recognize the pieces: Chopin nocturnes, Beethoven sonatas, and melancholy compositions he couldn't identify. The playing was always flawless, filled with an emotion that spoke of decades of practice and deep personal connection to the music. He found doors open with increasing frequency, always rooms that should have been locked. The library, a sitting room on the 3rd floor, various bedrooms throughout the manor. Each time he followed rule number 6 exactly, closing the door and sprinkling salt across the threshold. The salt was always gone by his next shift, but the doors remained closed. His name was called nightly now, always by voices he couldn't identify. Sometimes it was the soft, feminine voice he'd first heard, but other times it was a man's voice, deep and commanding, or a child's voice, high and plaintive. Marcus learned to ignore them all, humming to himself or focusing intently on his work until the calling stopped. The rules were working exactly as promised. By following them precisely, he'd found a way to coexist with whatever forces inhabited Ravens Hollow Manor. He was beginning to think he might actually make this job work long term. Then came the night he broke rule number 2. Marcus had been working at Ravens Hollow for exactly 3 weeks when it happened. He was cleaning the main staircase around 1:30 a.m. when he heard a sound from the east wing that made his blood freeze. A woman's scream, high and desperate, echoing through the corridors. The sound came again, clearly a cry for help, and Marcus dropped his cleaning supplies and ran toward the east wing without thinking. Someone was in trouble, possibly in danger, and his instinct to help overrode everything else. He was halfway down the east wing corridor before he remembered rule number 2. The east wing is off limits between midnight and 3 a.m. Do not enter this area during these hours under any circumstances. Marcus stopped dead, realizing his mistake, but the screaming continued, closer now, coming from one of the rooms ahead. It sounded like a young woman in terrible distress, and every instinct he had demanded that he continue forward to help her. But the rules had protected him so far. Breaking them now could have consequences he wasn't prepared to face. Marcus stood frozen in the hallway, torn between his human compassion and the supernatural constraints of his employment. The screaming continued for another minute, then gradually faded to sobbing, then to silence. He backed out of the east wing slowly, his heart hammering with guilt and fear. Whatever had been happening, he'd chosen to follow arbitrary rules instead of helping someone who might have been in genuine danger. Marcus completed his shift in a daze, unable to concentrate on his work. When 4 a.m. arrived, he returned to his apartment and sat on his bed, staring at the wall and trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. He'd made it through the night without encountering any consequences for his brief entry into the forbidden area. Maybe the rules had some flexibility, or maybe his quick retreat had prevented any serious violation. The next evening, he learned how wrong he was. Marcus began his shift as usual at 8 p.m., but something felt different about the manor from the moment he entered. The air seemed heavier, charged with an electric tension that made his skin crawl. The familiar portraits lining the hallways appeared to watch him more intently, and shadows seemed to move in his peripheral vision. He tried to maintain his normal routine, but the manor itself seemed to be working against him. Doors that should have been unlocked were sealed tight. His cleaning supplies went missing from where he'd left them, forcing him to search through storage closets to find replacements. Light bulbs flickered and died as he entered rooms, leaving him to work by the pale illumination filtering through the windows. At 10:30 p.m., as he was dusting the furniture in the main parlor, Marcus heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Heavy, deliberate steps that stopped just outside the doorway. Marcus Chen. The voice was deep and authoritative, with an accent that suggested old money and older traditions. Marcus looked toward the doorway and saw a tall man in an old-fashioned black suit standing in the shadows. Even in the dim light, he could see the resemblance to the portrait in the grand hall, the same sharp features, the same piercing gray eyes. Elias Ravenshollow stepped into the room, and Marcus felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. "You entered the East Wing last night," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. "The rules exist for very specific reasons," Elias continued, moving closer. "They maintain the delicate balance that allows us to coexist peacefully. When those rules are broken..." He gestured, and every mirror in the room shattered simultaneously, filling the air with glittering fragments that fell like deadly snow. "The balance is disturbed," Elias finished. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, feeling pieces of broken glass crunch under his feet. "I heard someone screaming. I thought someone needed help." "Someone always needs help in the East Wing," Elias said. "Someone always will. But there are some doors that must remain closed, some cries that must go unanswered. You were hired to maintain this house, not to save its residents." "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Ignorance is not an excuse for a custodian." Elias's eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. "You have violated the trust placed in you. There must be consequences." The room began to spin around Marcus, and he felt a pulling sensation, as if invisible hands were dragging him toward the doorway. He grabbed the back of a chair and held on, fighting against the supernatural force. "Please," he gasped. "I'll follow the rules exactly from now on. I won't make another mistake." Elias studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Perhaps, but trust, once broken, must be rebuilt. You will complete a task to demonstrate your commitment to the proper order of things. The pulling sensation stopped, and Marcus slumped against the chair, breathing heavily. What kind of task? The East Wing has been disrupted by your intrusion. The residents there are agitated, and their distress affects the entire manor. You will return there tomorrow night and restore the proper arrangements. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Return to the East Wing? But the rules will be suspended for you, temporarily, so that you may correct the damage you've caused. But understand this. The East Wing between midnight and 3 a.m. is forbidden for good reason. What you encounter there will test your resolve in ways you cannot imagine. Elias began to fade, becoming translucent around the edges. Complete this task successfully, and your employment will continue under the original terms. Fail, and you will join the previous custodians who chose not to respect our requirements. What happened to them? Marcus whispered. But Elias was gone, leaving only the scent of old roses and the glitter of broken glass on the parlor floor. Marcus spent the next day researching everything he could find about the East Wing and its history. The local library's resources were limited, but he managed to piece together fragments of the story from old newspaper clippings and society pages. The East Wing had been the private domain of the Ravenshollow family, containing their personal bedrooms, studies, and private sitting areas. According to the records, it had been sealed off after Eleanor's death in 1923, with instructions that it should never be disturbed. But the newspaper clippings hinted at darker secrets. There were references to tragic incidents and unfortunate circumstances involving various family members, always reported in the vague, euphemistic language of polite society. Thomas Ravenshollow's riding accident had occurred in the East Wing courtyard. Catherine Ravenshollow had been found dead in her bedroom there, apparently from a fall down the servants' stairs. Even Eleanor's death had happened in the East Wing, in what was described as her private study. Marcus also found several accounts of servants who had left Ravenshollow employment suddenly over the years, often with references to nervous conditions or unsuitability for the position. The pattern stretched back decades, suggesting that the manor's supernatural reputation was well established among the local community. As evening approached, Marcus felt his anxiety building to nearly unbearable levels. He considered packing his belongings and leaving, finding some other job, some other place to start over. But his financial situation made that impossible, and something deeper than mere economic necessity kept him at Ravenshollow. Despite everything that had happened, he felt a strange connection to the manor and its ghostly residents. They'd accepted his presence in their way, as long as he followed their rules. Breaking those rules had been his mistake, and perhaps completing this task would allow him to return to the strange but manageable routine he'd established. At 8 p.m., Marcus began his shift as usual, but his hands shook as he gathered his cleaning supplies. Tonight, he would have to enter the East Wing during the forbidden hours, and somehow restore the proper arrangements, whatever that meant. The manor felt different again, crackling with expectant energy. The piano music began earlier than usual, a frantic, discordant piece that sounded more like a warning than entertainment. Mrs. Eleanor appeared twice in the main hallway, both times staring directly at Marcus with an expression of deep concern. Even the portrait of Elias seemed more animated, the painted eyes tracking Marcus's movement with obvious interest. As midnight approached, Marcus made his way to the entrance of the East Wing. The heavy oak doors stood open, revealing a corridor that stretched into absolute darkness. The air that flowed from the opening was cold and carried the smell of dust, old roses, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that made his stomach turn. Marcus checked his watch. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until the forbidden hours began. 2 minutes until he would have to enter a place where the normal rules didn't apply and face whatever had been sealed away for nearly a century. He took a deep breath, picked up his flashlight, and stepped across the threshold. The darkness in the East Wing was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. His flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the shadows, providing only a few feet of visibility in any direction. The air was thick and oppressive, making each breath feel labored and inadequate. The corridor stretched ahead of him, lined with doors that stood open like hungry mouths. From each doorway came sounds, whispers, sobbing, the rustling of fabric, and occasionally soft laughter that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Marcus forced himself to move forward, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. The first room he passed was clearly a bedroom, its furniture covered with dust sheets that stirred in a breeze he couldn't feel. The second appeared to be a study, with books scattered across the floor and papers floating in the air like leaves caught in an updraft. In the third room, he found the source of the screaming he'd heard the night before. A young woman in a white nightgown sat on the edge of a four-poster bed, her face buried in her hands. She was crying, deep, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. As Marcus watched, she looked up, revealing a face of extraordinary beauty marred by absolute despair. "Help me," she whispered, reaching toward him with pale, trembling hands. "Please, I can't find my way out." Marcus took a step forward, every instinct demanding that he comfort this suffering woman. Then he remembered Elias's words. Someone always needs help in the East Wing. Someone always will. But there are some doors that must remain closed, some cries that must go unanswered. Understanding flooded through him. The East Wing wasn't just a sealed area, it was a prison, containing the spirits of family members who had died in trauma and despair. The rules weren't arbitrary traditions. They were barriers designed to keep these tortured souls contained. "I'm sorry," Marcus said to the woman. "I can't help you leave, but maybe I can help you find peace." He stepped out of the room and firmly closed the door. The crying continued for a moment, then gradually faded to silence. Marcus moved methodically through the East Wing, closing doors that had been opened by his intrusion the night before. Behind each door, he found another tragedy. Thomas Ravenshollow, still bleeding from his riding accident, calling for his father. Catherine Ravenshollow, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, asking why no one had come to help her. And in the final room, Eleanor herself, elderly and confused, searching desperately for her lost children. Each encounter was heartbreaking, but Marcus forced himself to maintain his resolve. These spirits were trapped by their own trauma, unable to move on, unable to accept their deaths. Keeping them contained in the East Wing wasn't cruelty. It was mercy, both for them and for the living world they could no longer inhabit safely. As he closed the last door, Marcus felt the oppressive atmosphere in the East Wing begin to lift. The whispers and sobbing faded, replaced by a sense of resigned calm. The darkness seemed less absolute, and his flashlight beam reached farther down the corridor. He made his way back to the entrance, but as he reached the threshold, a figure stepped out of the shadows to block his path. Elias Ravenshollow stood before him, but this time he didn't seem threatening. Instead, he looked tired, infinitely weary, like a man carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. "You understand now," Elias said softly. Marcus nodded. "They're your family. You're trying to protect them." "And protect the world from them," Elias replied. "Death came to them violently, unexpectedly. They cannot accept it, cannot move beyond the moment of their passing. Their anguish grows stronger with each year, and if they were to escape this wing," he gestured toward the manor beyond, "they would spread their despair like a plague. The living would suffer as they suffer. The rules contain their pain within these walls. But you're different," Marcus observed. "You can move freely through the manor. I died peacefully in my sleep, knowing my time had come. My spirit remains by choice, not compulsion. Someone must watch over them, must ensure the barriers hold." Elias's expression grew even more solemn. "It is a responsibility I have carried for over a century." Marcus felt a wave of sympathy for this ghostly patriarch, eternally bound to guard his traumatized family. Is there no way to help them find peace? Perhaps someday, but not yet. They are not ready to let go, and I am not ready to abandon them. Elias stepped aside, allowing Marcus to pass. "You have proven yourself worthy of trust. The rules will protect you, as they protect us all." Marcus emerged from the east wing as the clock struck 3 a.m. and immediately felt the manor's atmosphere return to its normal state of watchful calm. The oppressive darkness lifted, the whispers faded, and the familiar sounds of an old house settling resumed. He completed the rest of his shift without incident, but his mind was racing with everything he'd learned. The rules weren't the whims of eccentric employers. They were a carefully constructed system designed to maintain the balance between life and death, between past and present. Over the following weeks, Marcus found his relationship with the manor's ghostly residents evolving into something approaching normalcy. Mrs. Eleanor still appeared in the hallways, but now her nods of acknowledgement seemed warmer, more welcoming. The piano music continued nightly, but Marcus had learned to appreciate its beauty rather than fear its supernatural origin. He encountered Elias several more times, always briefly, always cordially. The ghostly patriarch would check on his progress, offer subtle guidance about maintaining the manor, and occasionally share fragments of family history that helped Marcus better understand his charges. "Catherine was the most talented of my children," Elias mentioned one evening as they stood together in the grand hall. "She played piano beautifully, composed her own pieces. The music you hear each night, those are her compositions." Marcus looked toward the music room, where the familiar melancholy melody was drifting through the air. "She's still playing." Music was her passion in life. In death, it remains her only joy. Elias's expression grew sad. If only she could find the same peace in other matters. The conversation gave Marcus new appreciation for the nightly concerts. Each piece was a message from beyond, a tortured soul expressing the emotions she could no longer voice directly. He began to listen more carefully, learning to distinguish between Catherine's different moods: melancholy, anger, desperate hope, and occasionally something that might have been contentment. Marcus also developed strategies for dealing with the more challenging aspects of his job. When doors were found open, he learned to sense which rooms contained active spirits and which were simply responding to the manor's supernatural energy. When his name was called, he could sometimes identify the voice and understand what the spirit might need, usually nothing more than acknowledgement of their presence. The work became less frightening and more purposeful. He wasn't just maintaining a building, he was caring for a family of souls who had nowhere else to go. 6 weeks into his employment, Marcus faced his greatest challenge yet. He was cleaning the second-floor hallway when he heard an unfamiliar sound. A child's voice, high and sweet, singing a lullaby he didn't recognize. The voice came from the direction of the east wing, but it was well past 3 a.m., and the forbidden area should have been sealed. Marcus approached the east wing entrance cautiously and found the doors standing wide open. The child's voice was clearer now, coming from deep within the corridor, accompanied by the sound of small feet running across wooden floors. Rule number 2 was clear. The east wing was off limits during the specified hours, but those hours had passed, and something was clearly wrong if a child's spirit had escaped the containment area. Marcus made a decision that would have terrified him weeks earlier. He entered the east wing. The corridor was no longer the oppressive tunnel of darkness he'd experienced during his punishment. Instead, it was simply an old hallway, dusty and unused, but not supernatural threatening. The child's voice led him to a room near the end of the wing, where he found something that made his heart break. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, sat on the floor playing with a collection of antique dolls. She had the distinctive Raven's Hollow features: dark hair, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, but her face was animated with the innocent joy of childhood. She looked up as Marcus entered, showing no fear or surprise. "Are you the new caretaker?" she asked in a clear, bright voice. Grandfather said someone new was taking care of the house. Marcus knelt down to her level, speaking gently. "Yes, I'm Marcus. What's your name?" "Rebecca Ravenshollow," she said proudly. "I'm Catherine's daughter. Well, I would have been if she'd lived long enough to have children." The tragedy of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. This child was a spirit who had never lived, created from Catherine's desperate longing for the family she'd never had. She was an echo of dreams that had died with her mother, given form by decades of accumulated grief. "Rebecca," Marcus said carefully, "you're not supposed to be out of your room this late." She nodded solemnly. "I know, but I heard you walking around and I got lonely. Mother has been very sad lately, and Father is always working in his study. Grandfather tries to visit, but he's very busy with his responsibilities." Marcus realized he was facing a unique situation. Rebecca wasn't a traumatized spirit like the other family members. She was innocence itself, untouched by the violence and despair that had claimed the others. But she was also the most dangerous, because she represented everything the Raven's Hollow spirits had lost and could never reclaim. "Would you like me to walk you back to your room?" Marcus offered. Rebecca nodded and took his hand with perfect trust. Her fingers felt real, warm, completely human. As they walked down the corridor together, she chattered about her dolls, her imaginary tea parties, and her hopes that her mother would feel better soon. At the door to her room, she looked up at Marcus with large, solemn eyes. "Will you come visit me again? I don't have many friends." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'll try, Rebecca, but you have to promise me something. Don't leave your room during the nighttime hours unless Grandfather says it's okay. The rules exist to keep everyone safe." "I promise," she said, and disappeared through the closed door like morning mist. Marcus stood in the hallway for several minutes, struggling with emotions he couldn't name. When he finally returned to the main manor, he found Elias waiting for him in the grand hall. "You met Rebecca," Elias said. It wasn't a question. She's not like the others. Number She is Catherine's creation, born from her desperate need to nurture something beautiful. Rebecca is what Catherine might have become if tragedy hadn't claimed her so young. Elias's expression was unreadable. She is also the most dangerous spirit in this house. Dangerous? She's just a child. She is innocence without understanding, love without boundaries. If she were to escape these walls, she would try to adopt every lonely person she encountered, pulling them into her supernatural family. Her kindness would be a trap more deadly than any malice. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. That's why the East Wing is sealed, not just to keep the traumatized spirits in, but to keep Rebecca from drawing others to join them. Precisely. And now she has formed an attachment to you. Elias studied Marcus intently. The question is, can you resist her pull while still showing her the compassion she craves? The remainder of Marcus's employment at Raven's Hollow Manor became a delicate balancing act. He continued his nightly duties while developing a deeper understanding of each spirit's needs and limitations. With Elias's guidance, he learned to provide companionship and care while maintaining the boundaries that kept everyone safe. He visited Rebecca twice a week during the permitted hours, always bringing small gifts, flowers from the garden, interesting stones he'd found on the grounds, or simple drawings he'd made during his free time. She treasured each offering and talked endlessly about her imaginary adventures, her love for her family, and her dreams of someday having friends to play with. Marcus learned to redirect her longing without crushing her spirit, suggesting that she help her mother by playing piano duets, which resulted in some of the most beautiful music the manor had ever heard, or assist her grandfather by organizing his study, which gave Elias brief moments of joy amid his eternal vigil. With Catherine, Marcus discovered that acknowledgement was often enough. When her piano playing became particularly frantic or despairing, he would sit quietly in the hallway outside the music room, letting her know through his presence that someone was listening, someone cared about her pain. The music would gradually calm, shifting from anguish to melancholy to something approaching peace. Mrs. Eleanor required the least intervention, but perhaps the most respect. Marcus learned to greet her with a formal nod when they encountered each other, treating her with the dignity due to the lady of the house. In return, she seemed to take a protective interest in his welfare, appearing whenever he worked in particularly isolated areas of the manor, as if standing guard. The other spirits, Thomas in his eternal confusion, the various relatives whose names Marcus never learned, required only that their doors be kept closed and their rest undisturbed. They were too lost in their individual tragedies to seek interaction with the living world. As winter deepened and spring approached, Marcus realized that Raven's Hollow Manor had become more than just his workplace. It had become his home. The living family who employed him remained absent, traveling indefinitely through Europe. But the dead family who shared his daily existence had accepted him as a permanent fixture in their eternal lives. He'd found a strange form of purpose in caring for these lost souls, helping them maintain their fragile peace while protecting the outside world from their supernatural influence. The work was lonely, demanding, and often heartbreaking, but it was also meaningful in a way that few jobs could be. One evening in early March, as Marcus was completing his final rounds, he encountered Elias in the library where it had all begun. "The family will return soon," Elias said without preamble. "They've completed their European tour and will be arriving next week to prepare for the summer season." Marcus felt a stab of anxiety. Will that change things? My position here? On the contrary, you've proven yourself invaluable. The living Ravens Hollows have no idea what truly inhabits their ancestral home, but they've noticed that the house seems more settled than it has in decades. Mrs. Whitmore has recommended that your position be made permanent. Relief flooded through Marcus, followed quickly by a deeper understanding. They don't know about any of you. It's better that way. They see this as a charming old house with interesting history. We prefer to keep it that way. Elias smiled. The first time Marcus had seen such an expression on the ghost's face. But they will need a caretaker they can trust, someone who understands the house's special requirements. And the rules will remain exactly as they are. Some traditions are too important to change. Elias began to fade as dawn approached. Welcome to the family, Marcus Chen. May your service here be long and peaceful. Marcus stood in the gardens behind Ravens Hollow Manor, watching the sunrise paint the ancient stones with golden light. His first year as a permanent caretaker had brought challenges he'd never anticipated, but also rewards he couldn't have imagined. The living Ravens Hollows, an elderly couple and their adult children, had proven to be kind, eccentric employers who appreciated his dedication to maintaining their ancestral home. They spent their summers at the manor, hosting elaborate parties and family gatherings, completely unaware that their ghostly relatives watched from the shadows with approval and occasional amusement. During the winter months, when the living family retreated to their New York penthouse, Marcus resumed his role as guardian of the dead. He'd refined the rules over the year, developing new protocols for situations that arose and deepening his understanding of each spirit's needs. Rebecca had grown particularly attached to him, and he'd had to establish careful boundaries to prevent her supernatural influence from becoming dangerous. But their weekly visits remained the highlight of both their existences. She delighted in having someone to talk to, he finding joy in her innocent wonder at the world. Catherine's piano playing had evolved as well. The desperate anguish that had characterized her early performances had given way to more complex emotional landscapes. She'd even begun composing new pieces, working through her trauma one note at a time. Mrs. Eleanor had become something approaching a friend, their formal relationship warming into genuine mutual respect. She'd begun leaving small gifts for him, flowers that never wilted, books that appeared on his nightstand, tea that stayed perfectly warm no matter how long he left it sitting. And Elias had begun to speak of the future with something that might have been hope. The family's wounds were slowly healing, their need for containment gradually lessening. Perhaps someday they might find the peace that had eluded them for so long. Marcus checked his watch. 7:45 a.m. In 15 minutes, he would begin his day shift, maintaining the manor for its living inhabitants. Tonight, at 8 p.m., he would begin his real work, caring for the family that time had left behind. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen. And as he walked back toward the manor, Marcus couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The rules of Ravens Hollow Manor were simple after all. Follow them exactly, show proper respect, and remember that some families extend beyond the boundaries between life and death. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of piano music drifting from the music room. Catherine welcoming the dawn with a melody that spoke of hope, healing, and the enduring power of love to transcend even death itself. Marcus smiled and quickened his pace. He had work to do.